Mr. Floyd, based on your review of the video, did start complaining of shortness of breath prior to being placed in the prone position, right?
Yes, I heard on more than one occasion he say the words, "I can't breathe."
And if Mr. Floyd had simply gotten in the back seat of the squad car, do you think that he would have survived?
Check, Your Honor. It's not calling for medical testimony.
You may give if you have a medical opinion as to that.
Overruled to that extent.
So, had he not been restrained in the way in which he was, I think he would have survived that day. I think he would have gone home or wherever he was going to go had he not been subjected to the prone and positional restraint that he was.
So in other words, if he had gotten in the squad car, he'd be alive.
I think my answer remains the same. Anything other than that scenario that he was subjected to, I have no reason to think from a medical perspective that he would not have survived that day, correct?
And in terms of the prone position, you would agree that the prone position is not in and of itself inherently dangerous?
In an ordinary individual, if we were to take away everything else that was going on and someone was just simply lying in the prone position, while there are many patients who that would be inherently dangerous, the average individual, I would agree with you, probably just lying flat in that situation generally wouldn't be dangerous.
Even in the ICU, there are circumstances where people have serious medical conditions where they're maintained in the prone position. Agreed?
In the ICU, when patients are put into the prone position, it is when it is a desperate attempt to save someone's life where their lungs have actually developed what we call acute respiratory distress syndrome, or ARDS. They have a ventilator in to make sure that the amount of air that they get, no matter their positioning, will always be enough. And so it's a funny thing to think about putting someone in the prone positioning in the ICU on a respirator, but because of respiratory physiology, sometimes that will actually help open up certain segments of the lungs that are needed for oxygenation. But it's really important to keep in mind that they are on a respirator every single time to open up those lung airways, and they're usually on sedation as well to keep them comfortable.
And my last question, doctor, is after someone's heart stops, is it possible that they continue to respire?
It is, well, I'm not sure I could answer that with certainty other than to say there are these things that are called agonal breaths. So when I'm in the intensive care unit with a patient who is dying and they go into cardiac arrest, once in a while you will see them take one or two extra breaths. I'm not sure the exact mechanism or the physiologic trigger for that. So you could potentially see some extra breaths for a short period of time.
By a short period of time, up to a minute?
In my experience, if the heart has completely stopped, I would not expect to see the breathing continue for up to a minute, but I might expect it to be seen for several seconds.
Did Mr. Floyd die a sudden death?
Mr. Floyd died a gradual death. It would not be considered the classic sudden death from the standpoint of how you're putting into that context, meaning when people have that ventricular fibrillation, that VF arrest, they literally go from being fine one moment to completely out the next. You know, I don't know what happened. I was sitting next to him and he keeled over and was on the ground, and then that could have been a VF arrest. So sometimes there's semantics in terms of this, but in the case of Mr. Floyd, yes, he did have a cardiopulmonary arrest, but no, he did not. There was no evidence of a sudden cardiac death from VFib or any other malignant heart arrhythmia. As far as I can tell from reviewing all of the facts of the case, I see no evidence at all to suggest that a fentanyl overdose caused Mr. Floyd's death.
So, Dr. Rich, then, taking into account all of the evidence that you reviewed, do you have an opinion to a reasonable degree of medical certainty as to whether Mr. Floyd's death was preventable?
Yes, I do.
Would you tell us what that opinion is?
Yes, I believe that Mr. George Floyd's death was absolutely preventable.
Were there critical points in time during his subdual and restraint on the ground when you feel measures could have or should have been taken that would have preserved his life?
Yes, I do. I think there were several junctures, actually.
Would you tell us about those?
Sure. Well, the first, of course, was to not subject him to that initial prone restraint positioning that he was subjected to. I mean, that is first and foremost. So if that was not the case, I don't think he would have died. The second, though, was when he was in that subdual and restraint positioning, and he was stating repeatedly that he can't breathe, and he was getting a little weaker in his speech. There was one moment in the video where I heard one of the officers saying, I think he's passing out. That would have been an opportunity to quickly relieve him from that position of not getting enough oxygen, perhaps turn him into a recovery position and allow him to start to expand his lungs again and bring in oxygen and get rid of carbon dioxide. So in addition to not putting him in that position in the first place, when there were signs that he was worsening, repositioning him, I think very likely would have also saved his life.